Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the program, Brooklyn Resists, Act 3, Black Lives Matter. The last of 3 programs that look at the long history of movements for racial justice in Brooklyn. Especially today, where we reflect and remember George Floyd, who was murdered by police 1 year ago, as well as the lives of people who have been victims of racial and state-sponsored violence in the US and abroad. My name is Nialah Edari. I'm the Assistant Director for Collections and Public Service at the Center for Brooklyn History, a research center at the Brooklyn Public Library. We're honored to be partnering on this series with New York University's Brooklyn-based 370J project, the Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, the Center for Black Visual Culture, and the Institute for Public Knowledge. For the Center for Brooklyn History, tonight is part of a public history initiative that explores how the protest movement of the present ties to generations of activists and leaders who came before. The Brooklyn Resist Project is a multi-part initiative. It includes documenting protest actions in Brooklyn, an exhibition on the exterior of our building at Pierpont Street, which will open in mid-June, public programs, and much more. We have an amazing panel with us today, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. But before I turn it over to them, I want to share a few important notes. First, during the discussion, a link will be posted in the chat to purchase books our speakers have authored. In support of local businesses, our link is to the community bookstore in Brooklyn. I also want to share that tonight's program includes closed captions. That function is available at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I want to invite all of you to share your questions. Simply type them into the Q&A box on your screen. It's been a joy to partner with NYU on this series, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa M. Coleman, NYU's inaugural Senior VP for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation and Chief Diversity Officer. Reporting to the President, Dr. Coleman works with the Office of the Provost, Deans, other senior leaders, and constituents to advance, promote, and build capacity for strategic global inclusion, diversity, equity, belonging, and innovation initiatives across NYU globally. Prior to NYU, Dr. Coleman served as the first special assistant to the president at Harvard University and chief diversity officer. Dr. Coleman, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nialah. I appreciate that warm welcome. I hope everyone's taking care. Before we move into the program, we'd like to take some time to honor the indigenous lands, indigenous peoples whose lands we now occupy. We acknowledge that many of us here in this virtual space, but many of our institutions and homes are located on the unceded lands of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge that the United States was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, as well as the discounted labor of many indigenous as well as other marginalized communities. We continue in our efforts to both recognize and dismantle these ongoing systems of exclusion and oppression. Again, I hope everyone is taking really good care. People keep saying this is a new normal. It is not. It is quite unusual, and we have stress, home care, new colleagues, all sorts of things, and of course, lots of pressures. Thank you to our frontline workers who place themselves at risk every day, whose labor is often unseen and unrecognized, those who make our daily work and lives possible, our healthcare professionals, facilities and systems maintenance teams, grocery store workers, delivery teams, and of course, janitorial and sanitation services. A lot has happened this year. We remain in solidarity to repudiate anti-Asian and anti-Black violence. We are still in the midst of, as Nialah mentioned, health and social crises and transformations, the murders and loss of life among BIPOC children and adults combined and compounded by the continued disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 among marginalized communities around the globe, make our work and our responsibility to be aware of these historical trajectories of state, national, and ongoing systemic oppressions and the impact on communities, as well as the work that we need to do to move toward transformation and liberation. And as Atiba mentioned, today we mark the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which makes tonight's program and programs such as these crucial to helping us deepen our knowledge and informing our action to dismantling intersectional inequities. We are so happy to partner again on these important programs. I can't believe it's the third and final program. I want to especially thank Natiba, Marcia, Heather, Michelle of the Center for Brooklyn History, Ellen Toscano and the NYU Brooklyn-based 370 Project, Deb Willis of the Center for Black Visual Culture, and Jessica Coffey of the Institute for Public Knowledge, and of course, our panelists. What a stellar panel we have tonight. Thank you for partnering with NYU and in particular the Office of Global Inclusion on this important program. And thank you to my entire team and in particular Autumn Rain for her work. I say I have an amazing team and it's a pleasure to not only work in partnership with you all, but with this team. And now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator. Jami, I can't believe this is my third time and this is the last one, but it's been such a pleasure to work with you as well. As many of you know, Jami Floyd is well known as the former local host, of course, of All Things Considered and legal editor in the WNYC Newsroom. She also now leads WNYC's Race and Justice Unit that covers news through the prisms of race, class, and social justice. With a degree from Berkeley Law School, Floyd taught law at Stanford Law School before embarking on a journalism career that now spans over 2 decades and has included stints at ABC News, CBS News, Court TV, and she has appeared as a legal and political consultant on many, many news outlets, including CNN, Fox News, NBC, MSNBC, and PBS. And now I turn it over to you, Jami.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. I hope you all can hear me. I am not in my usual location. I am actually downtown, Lower East Side proud, because I will share with you that my mother had a health scare today. And I almost didn't make it to this panel. Marcia Ely, thank you so much for yanking me back into the present moment and reality. My mother is okay, but even in the midst of her pain and distress, she said, this is the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. That's what she said. She said, I want you to think about that, Jami Floyd, because we share his name. And we do share his name. And we share his journey. We share this anniversary. And we still have so much work to do. And that's why we're here tonight together in solidarity. I want to introduce our panel. It is a stellar panel, Lisa Coleman. You are right. Let's begin by introducing Elizabeth Hinton, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Yale University and Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Her research focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality and inequities, and urban violence in the 20th century in the United States. And of course, she is one of the nation's leading experts on the criminalization and policing in this country. And her recently released book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion, will be one of our topics tonight. Since the 1960s, it's garnered enormous recognition, including from the New York Times, which praised it as, quote, groundbreaking, deeply researched, and profoundly heartrending, which of course it is. And of course, she also wrote From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Hinton, for being with us tonight. We also have Nialah Edari, the co-founder of Freedom March NYC, a youth protest and policy group pushing for nonviolent reform in New York City, and across the nation, I would add, a leader of New York City's protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder a year ago today. She's been recognized by Vogue magazine and others as one of the trailblazing activists across the globe. And the Financial Times recognized her as one of the leading women of 2020. Columbia University as one of 8 Columbians you should know. And New York State Senate honored her with a proclamation and of activism in this country in service to the community during Black History Month. And finally, I'm so pleased to introduce to you Junior Mintt, a Brooklyn-based activist and drag artist who has made it her mission to spread the message of Black trans power. She was the host of the June 14th, 2020 Brooklyn Liberation Action in support of Black trans lives that took place at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. 15,000 people, many of whom marched through Brooklyn to Fort Greene were there. Mintt's drag performances reflect intersectional empowerment messages and combine motivational speaking, comedy, and political statements and music. And we need a little laughter sometimes to help us get through the dark times. Junior Mintt, thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to begin, well, thank you for being with us, and maybe you can make us smile along the way in this conversation. But I'm going to start, I think, with a question to Elizabeth Hinton, and it's a very straight up question. And the question is whether or not America is still on fire. Your book is America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. Here we are in 2021. Elizabeth Hinton, is America still on fire?
Well, I think, last summer's both nonviolent and violent protests proved that we still are, but it's on fire because the racial inequities that have defined this country since its founding remain pervasive. And in the post-civil rights period in particular, the federal policymakers and lawmakers at all levels of government have embraced policing and expanded surveillance and incarceration in targeted communities of color and among marginalized groups as a way to manage the material consequences of poverty and inequality. And let me also just say, Jami, thank you so much for being here and moderating, especially given everything else that you've been confronting today with your mother. Bless her for giving you the blessing to have this conversation in the context of George Floyd, your namesake's murder. And also thank you to the Brooklyn Public Library and NYU for hosting. I'm so thrilled to be here and among such distinguished panelists and looking forward to the conversation.
It has been a wonderful partnership, and we do want to encourage questions from the audience. So please post those and they will be shared with me and I will share them with our panel. But let me ask our other 2 panelists to follow up on that same question. Is America still on fire? Is it in 2021 as much on fire as it was in, say, 1961? Nialah Edari, what say you?
Yeah, I would say I definitely can't speak to the experience that my grandparents may have faced living under segregation, but we are still facing the same issues in regards to police brutality. Even with a conviction for Derek Chauvin, someone was murdered by police officers a week prior to that conviction, and I'm sure since that conviction there have been other unarmed and armed Black and brown people that have been murdered by the police.
Junior Mintt, America on Fire?
I concur with both of them. Very much, the fire never stopped burning, so the fire has only gotten worse, and we see all of those fires popping up more simply because we have cameras attached to ourselves now. And I think that once you really understand that the whole system has never been working properly and it's just us putting Band-Aids on a gunshot, that it's never going to actually help anything. And so, yes, absolutely, we're still raging. And I'm just happy to be on a panel with amazing people who have the platforms that I love and respect, and platforms that are enriching, enlightening, and enfranchising people. So yes, absolutely, the fire is still burning, but people like us are what are drawing attention to it.
Can I just pick up real quick on something that Junior just said, if I may, which is that
please go ahead.
The fires that have continued to burn, of course, as she alluded to, is the police violence. I mean, I think one thing that's really important and distinct from the protests that we've seen from Ferguson and Michael Brown's killing onwards is that they all, unlike the rebellions of the 60s and 70s and what we in Miami in 80 and the LA rebellion in 92, all of the recent uprisings have started peacefully. They've started with nonviolent protests and peaceful vigils, and the police come in with their fires. They come in with tear gas, and they come in beating nonviolent protesters with their batons. And as we know, this cycle of police violence then elicits some violent responses from protesters. So, you know, in many ways, the people in the struggle, we have become more nonviolent, right? And the police have maintained their same levels of violence.
Let me ask you to pick up also, Elizabeth Hinton, on something Junior Mintt said, and then ask the panel to respond about platforms. Because we do know, of course, in the post-Reconstruction era, the 20s into the 30s, there was mass violence against Black people, Black and brown people, entire communities razed, right? Black Wall Street, St. Louis, East St. Louis, Rosewood, and then the lynchings continued. Those of us who studied this know this. Most Black and brown people know this. White people know this. But there were not cameras, right? So talk a little bit about the power of the body cam, of course, but more so social media and our ability to share and know and understand the pain of this use of force against Black and brown people, violent or nonviolent, but mostly nonviolent people who are protesting and experience this use of force.
So I just want to also emphasize something really important that you said, Jami, and that's actually, you know, for most of the history of this country, the so-called rioting, the collective violence has been white supremacist vigilante groups against communities of color. That's what most of US history has been about. And that's part of the reason why I use the term rebellion to describe the political violence in the civil rights and immediate post-civil rights period, because it was only when Black people started engaging collective violent tactics against exploitative and repressive institutions that this form of violence was criminalized and labeled a riot, and police then were used as the kind of ultimate response to it. Whereas in the, white vigilante violence, and we see this from, Tulsa in 1921, the 100-year commemoration of the massacre of the Greenwood community is coming up. Police and white vigilante groups have been deeply, deeply entangled throughout our history. And we saw that once again being exposed January 6th. I mean, I think, social media has definitely changed it has changed white Americans and the larger American public's awareness of the dynamics of violence and the kind of policing strategies that have been going on for centuries. I mean, well, since emancipation, and that escalated in the context of the new federal investment in crime control that occurred at the height of progressive social change and the civil rights revolution beginning in the mid-1960s. So what the cameras in our pockets mean is that there's now proof to expose the dynamics that have been terrorizing Black communities, whether through vigilante mob violence or state-sanctioned police violence from emancipation onward.
Nialah Edari, I want to ask you the same question, but really very much from the point of view of your work, because, the organizers, you mentioned that you couldn't really speak to the 60s and your grandparents, but the organizers of the 60s, and I was an infant in 64, say when the Civil Rights Bill, that was the year of my birth, the year the Civil Rights Bill was passed, the sort of culmination of much of their work. But I know, having read about it, the ways in which they thought about media presence. Let's make sure the Times is there and the photographers are there when we march across the bridge in Selma, so that when we're beaten, it's photographed and Northerners see what's happening. So there was a strategic use of media, almost a manipulation of media, so those images got out there, and it was very powerful, and change occurred as a result. Can you speak to the use of social media? Because you're a policy and protest group. You're a policy group, but also a protest group. Can you talk about using the platforms at your disposal to engage in both protest and policy in a way that is visually and socially compelling? How do you use social media to achieve your goals in a way that catches the eye of not just the people who are on your side already, but those who you want to convince to believe in your cause?
Okay. Well, firstly, I want to mention that when I said that I can't speak on behalf of my grandparents who lived in the 60s, I meant that I did not want to negate or compare their experience, because a lot of times we see these shirts like, I am not my ancestors, and we don't necessarily understand what they went through or how strong they could have been just because their activism may not look like mine today. So that's why I made that statement, but not that I wasn't, understand the 60s or what went down. In regards to social media has absolutely helped with Freedom March NYC, and a lot of people who've been organizing since 2014 after Mike Brown, and even Trayvon Martin in 2012. You post one thing, it can be shared 4,000 thousands of times and reach people well outside of your network. I know with Freedom March NYC's first march, my post was shared 500 times. I usually don't get that many shares, and I'm sure other people who weren't following me on Instagram were sharing that post. And when we went outside that night, May 31st, most of the people that were there were people that I didn't know. And that's because of the power of social media, how a message can be shared. I posted something today that was shared 3,000 times. Out of all those people that shared it, I probably only know 3% of those 3,000 people who shared my post. So it definitely helps in terms of amplification, but I know sometimes it can also be very frustrating when these crimes are committed on camera and yet there still isn't justice. And not to say that justice is a conviction, because justice for me means that that person is alive, that person wouldn't have died. But
You're right.
The fact that you can record something but still nothing happens. And I know with Eric Gardner, for instance, one of the guys who was recording that, he's now in Rikers and he's been through jail, and they've been finding different things to, keep him in jail, and he's been having a hard time. So there's also backlash that you get from police by being someone who records a police brutality incident. So it's great having on camera. So people, I think more so it helps people who don't know, like Black people, brown people. We already know what's been going on in our neighborhood, video, phone or not. I think last year we were all stuck in the house. So people who weren't aware or who didn't grasp on in 2012 or 2014, they're like, wow, this is what Black people go through. I need to be outside. So it's definitely a great way to get new people involved in this movement. I've never seen so many white people outside of my life last year. And I know that was because of social media. That was because that young Black woman was courageous enough to take that video and share it so people could see for themselves. I myself don't watch murder happen on camera because it's too traumatic for me, but other people were able to see that. I'm like, wow, this is something that happens in America every day, not just Minneapolis, in New York City, in the South, West Coast, all over. And I think that would really connect more people to our movement, and we're more comfortable with saying Black Lives Matter instead of All Lives Matter, because there was a time, just a couple of years ago, where All Lives Matter was taboo and Black Lives Matter was the radical thing to say.
Junior Mintt, you were the person who started us thinking about platform and social media. Do you want to speak to this a bit?
When it comes to my platform and the ways in which I use it, I've learned that for myself and my own personal use of my platform, I found that being a Black trans queer woman, there's so many intersections of identity that I live at that I was trying to think of what was the perfect way to be an activist, the perfect way to use my platform. And I realized the best way to do that is honestly, is to truly live my authentic life and share what my experiences are like, what it's actually like to have to choose what it's like for me to walk out the door. Because if I dress the way that I want, that affirms me, I get catcalled. If I dress in a way that will stop me from being catcalled, I get misgendered. So it's one of those things where sharing that experience and sharing all the different ways I have to navigate my reality is just a small way in which it sucks to have to say, but it humanizes me to privileged people. And it's so weird to have to say because they don't see me as a person. And what I've learned through my platform so much is it's easy for people to humanize you through social media, but there's a disconnect between humanizing you through social media and when they see you on the street. And that is part of what I do with my platform. And so like I work in nightlife, I do motivational speaking, I do a variety of things. I do writing, been featured in The Cut, Paper Magazine, all these things, all of which has all been because I like to remind people of the power they have every day. The fact that if you say that you care about Black trans lives mattering, then that means that when you're going out, are you making sure that Black trans people have enough money to catch a car home so they don't have to walk home? Are you making sure that you are doing things in your everyday reality to actually enfranchise people in ways that like don't have to be just through social media? Yes, donate to a GoFundMe, but also do you care about the homeless person who's outside the Starbucks? And I think that what has happened throughout this entire pandemic is what I tell everybody is when white people get uncomfortable, change starts happening. And this entire pandemic made white people realize that yes, you have to care about the person at the bodega who's homeless because that person's health is your health, but also that's a person. That's a person who doesn't have the same access to things that you have simply because of a rigged system. And once you begin to connect all the rigories of the system, that's the moment where I've realized privileged people begin to realize that, oh, wait, okay, so I have to care about free and available vaccines for everybody because not only this person needs it, but also I need it. But on top of it, that then ties into, well, where's that person gonna live after they get that vaccine? Where's all the other things that are tied to this person's humanity that you haven't thought about just because the first thing you can now think about is a vaccine? So really connecting humanity off of the screen to humanity on the screen, because both are amazing. Showing people as who they truly are, living their authentic lives without having to worry about who is viewing them and the ways in which they are being viewed are exceptionally empowering. But it's also making sure that just as Dave Chappelle said, you're not getting the wrong type of laughter, you're not getting the wrong type of attention, because I don't need your attention if what you're gonna do is dehumanize me. And that's what I do with my platform.
That's really beautiful what you just, all that you just said, especially I was gonna ask you, what are you talking about when you say the disconnect between the screen, the person they see on the screen and the real human being, but then you explained it so well. But can you say a little bit more about the humor? You just said the David Chappelle line about the wrong kind of humor. Say a little bit about humor and the role it plays for you in this very, I mean, it's hard to have a laugh, right? It's hard. I find it very hard to smile. I'm so serious. I mean, I smile. You see me smiling now, but that's about all you're going to get. So talk a little bit about that part of your work and your life and how you find room for that, frankly. Help us out, Junior Mintt.
I always think of two things. One is what my mom always said growing up, you have to laugh to keep from crying, because there will always be a million different things that you can look at that are going to make you realize how horrible the world is, how horrible life is. That's how the whole world is set up. Capitalism is literally set up to make you think that you don't have what you need, so you then put more money in to get things you need. There's a reason why I tried so many crash diets when I was 60 pounds overweight growing up. There's so many reasons why I never took a shirt off when I was at the pool, and realizing that there is always going to be a thing that is limiting me, especially as like every Black person knows it, every woman knows it, every trans person knows it, every queer person knows it, that just coming out the womb is who you are. Okay, so there's things set up against me. But the one thing I can control is how I respond to it. And I don't let it get in the way of the happiness that I experience. I realize that and also as well, finding joy in different things and seeing things in a new way. Realizing that this panel is the embodiment and the amplification of people using their power. A bunch of people with platforms, money, privilege, jobs, sat down and said, what can we do for the community? What can we do to have voices be amplified, history be recited, have people who do not get the opportunity to have their voice heard in different spaces, be heard in different spaces. So finding that, but then on top of it, what my mom always repeated from the Addams Family movie was the Addams Family, like their family crest was, what is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. For me, witnessing this moment of the pandemic and not being able to go places is the embodiment of what it means to be a Black trans woman. Knowing that there are certain spaces I can't go in simply because of my life. I can't go to certain places in the city because literally it will mean my life. The same way leaving the house without a mask on meant my life. So for me, I realized that all of the Black trans individuals I know, all of the disenfranchised people who are at all of these horrible intersections, like one of my best friends is an African immigrant queer woman who's also a single mother, who during this pandemic was trying to fight for her immigration status, trying to make sure that her kids stayed with her and not her husband and her ex-husband and all these other things. And that was before the pandemic. So for me, it's like, oh yeah, this is just everyday reality. This is just, at this point, I've had to create so many GoFundMes for friends for top surgeries. I've had to do all these different things for friends of mine before the pandemic. So for me, this was all just an exemplification of privileged people becoming uncomfortable with realizing that, like, yeah, the system is rigged and it's not going to take care of you the same way it never took care of me.
Well,
And
thank
I can laugh at it because on top of it, I'm here. That's the thing. The system failed. I am the embodiment of hundreds and hundreds of years of disenfranchisement. The system, how many amazing people in my family had to say, we're going to keep going when the world told them they shouldn't? Because I look at myself as a Black trans woman, from Marsha, from Sylvia to Miss Major, to people in my ancestry who spent months on a ship with no windows, no light. Well, I get to stand here as my proud self saying I exist, and that is the biggest fuck you to white supremacy. That is the biggest fuck you I can give. Living my best authentic life is exactly who I am, and everybody should.
All right. Nialah, let me come back over to you. This is going to seem like a hard turn, but it's not. Because you said something earlier. I asked Junior Mintt about comedy, and this is going to seem like a hard turn, what we call a hard turn in my business, but it's not. You had said earlier that you don't watch all of the murder videos. I want to ask you, we talk about power of social media. What about the trauma of social media? How do we, as Black and brown people, but even just as compassionate people, because there are a lot of people on this call who are not African American on this in this webinar, as compassionate people, how do we decide how much of it to digest, what to digest? I mean, for a long time, I felt obligated. In fact, I still do, because I'm a journalist. I feel obligated to watch these videos. I feel it's my responsibility as a Black woman. I've got to watch these videos. It's my burden. It's my responsibility. So what do you say to that as an activist, as a policymaker, as a Black person? It's there. Now we have it. It helps us move the needle, but it does do psychic trauma, does it not?
It definitely does. And I would say that you don't necessarily need to see it to believe it. Like, I trust your word that it happened, and I'm regarding it into it as death, like a murder happening. Like, you don't need to see it to believe that it happened. And for me, like Junior, she mentioned COVID and the pandemic. I had to stop watching the news every day in March because I was getting obsessed. And then I had my Citizens app, and then I was scared to go outside. I'm like, oh my gosh, something's happening at every turn. So then I just stopped watching news completely, which was crazy because I also started working on a presidential campaign. And then someone found out that I didn't watch the news, but I was just getting tired because it became so traumatic. And that's similar for Black deaths. I had to take some time off from organizing in 2015 to basically 2020 because it was just so traumatic and detrimental to my mental health. And I would say that you don't need to, like I mentioned earlier, you don't need to see those things, fill your timeline with things you want to see, mute things if you have to mute it. I know this is definitely different in your line of work, but as an organizer, like I make a choice of what I choose to engage in. And sometimes things just show up on my page because people, you know, they don't care. They're going to post a Black girl getting swung around, whatever. I just mute it. And that is the benefit of having those tools on Instagram, on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook, but on Facebook it's just muting and blocking. Like you can curate your own timeline. You can curate what you want to see. I think it froze a little bit.
Well, I'll comment on that.
Right, right. Which again is about power over your social. It's coming to you, Elizabeth Hinton. And then I also wanted to ask you to speak to it as a professor. What do you tell your?
Yeah, so that's what.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, I think the other aspect, I also don't watch the videos because it's traumatic for me. And I think there is something where, you know, seeing these images, these constant images of Black death and pain and suffering ends up normalizing Black death and pain and suffering in the American consciousness. So I know, for instance, like a lot of my colleagues will show images of lynching. And I think there is power in confronting that violence head on. But I also think then I personally don't show images of lynching. What I show in class when I do lecture on lynching and mob violence are the pictures of the mobs, are the pictures of the white men, or mostly white men and families, their babies there, their young white children witnessing these things there too, who practiced this terror against people of color in this country. And I do think that, you know, in kind of and consuming these videos again and again and again, it ends up becoming something that that is normalized. And speaking, you know, to a point that I think Junior made absolutely beautifully, I think it then leads to this disconnect where people watch these videos on social media, and then they like hashtag, you know, the person, or they'll hashtag Black Lives Matter, or they'll black out their screen for the day or whatever. And then like, that's their activism. And that then becomes a substitute. Like, that's what the disconnect is. That then becomes like the hashtag on social media, watching the video and expressing outrage becomes the substitute for actually doing the work of getting into the streets, of keeping pressure on elected officials, on organizing in our communities, on being true allies, if you're a white person, to marginalized groups, giving that homeless trans person a meal who needs it. Exactly what Junior was talking about. That's how we get real change and transformation. I think that's one of the dangers of the kind of like hashtag activism that has really emerged. And in many ways, you know, it's sustained and built awareness to these issues, but at the same time, it can't become a substitute entirely for the basic social justice that we need.
And say a bit more, if you would, Professor Hinton, about what we can do. I mean, obviously, some of us can create protest movements. Some of us can become law professors. Some of us can become comedian activists. So we've got all of that on this panel. But what about the average citizen who does see a video like this? Say a bit more about how to bridge that disconnect. If you feel that, okay, I saw this on my screen, I do want to do more than just, you know, witness it and then black out my screen for the day. I really want to engage with the humanity. What can the average citizen do to make sure that they are doing the work?
So
they're doing the work.
Right. So if we look to the past of the freedom struggle, you know, it does take getting out into the streets to protest. I mean, we know that people in power, that elected officials never make changes out of the goodness of their heart. It requires mass mobilization. It requires coalition building. It requires sustained organizing and political education. And so that means that, you know, people need to go out and get in the streets and protest. That means that people need to initiate petition campaigns and keep pressure on elected officials. That means that they need to donate to organizations that are doing this work and support lawsuits against unjust and arbitrary laws. There are all kinds of ways that people can keep the pressure. But I think one thing that's been really clear is that we are at this extreme crossroads in this moment, and there's a power struggle and there is a backlash against what we know most Americans at this point want. Most Americans do support ideas of racial justice. Most Americans want to see a different kind of governance, and there's a minority of people in power who are trying to hold on to and basically completely erode democracy in the process, hold on to white supremacy and the old ways. And so I think we have those of us who want to realize racial justice in this country and realize social justice and equity for all people. We have a real battle of hearts and minds before us that may take generations. So I think a big part of this is going to be in education and political education. People at home who might want to black out their screens and hashtag it also takes the work of of reading and of educating your peers and of calling out racism and injustice when you see it and not just allowing it to happen. It's about keeping pressure on the political and economic elite, but it's also keeping pressure within each other. We all are complicit in these systems of oppression, and we all have a role to play in undoing them.
And since this is Brooklyn Resists, right, and I want to bring it home, what specifically, let me ask you specifically, Professor, and then I'm going to come to the rest of the panel and go to one or two questions. What about NYPD? What about the police department? And I'm asking you as a lawyer, do we defund? Do we abolish? Do people in Black and Brown communities really want that? Because I will tell you, as I'm doing a project right now, not rooted in Brooklyn, it's rooted in Mott Haven, so the Bronx. But you know, half the people say yes, get them out, and then the other people say, the other half say, no, I need. We're ignored by the police. Where are the police? We need more police. So what's the answer? I know it's unfair to ask you that at the end of the panel. That's to ask you to solve that problem, Professor Hinton. But give us a snapshot.
Okay, so I think part of it is that we and this is how we've gotten into this mess from the 60s forward. We have to look beyond the police, and we also know that in our communities, in Black and brown communities, people tend to embrace policies that are less punitive. What people want are robust and vibrant institutions. What people want are jobs and investments into public schools and healthcare and essentially decent housing. I mean, if we really are serious about fostering public safety, then we need a more expansive definition of public safety that doesn't begin with the police, that begins with the community, that begins in supporting a different set of investments to really deal with the root causes of poverty and crime and violence or social harm in our communities. Police, which have been, the kind of front line of managing the material consequences of poverty and inequality, that set of policies has not worked. And that's really what defund is about. It's about, we need a different set of investments, and this practice of bringing in usually an outsider in a uniform with a gun to handle all sorts of social problems has only exacerbated these very problems. So police reform is not going to do it. Police cannot be reformed. It's time to now think about crime prevention and public safety as a comprehensive program that will build and sustain vibrant communities.
Nialah, it sounds pretty consistent with your mission, right? What she just said?
Absolutely, I agree. I just had an interview yesterday where I was saying that police does not necessarily equal public safety, and that there are organizations that directly address gun violence, and that do gun violence prevention work that the community knows they feel comfortable with, that are able to, talk amongst gang members because they have former gang members as their employees. And I think you work with the people by being amongst the people, not above them. And having more police in the neighborhood could ultimately result in just more arrest of innocent Black and brown people. And as we saw that with the creation of Stop and Frisk.
Right, right. And even with that consent decree, which says you're not supposed to be doing the stop and frisk, targeting Black and brown people 10 plus years ago, we're still having a problem with it. Junior Mintt, talk to us about police and the intersection of policing and Black and brown trans community.
Well, absolutely, completely concur with what they've been saying, and I'll add on top of it that the policing system that we witness now is nothing more than like slavery 2.0. And because the police department is nothing more than another iteration of slave patrols, the same way that the prison industrial complex is nothing more than a modern iteration of enslavement just turned into peonage. And so on top of the added fact of we need to add money and budgetary consideration for social services, we need to understand that adding more money, adding anything to a whole system that is nothing more than rooted in enslavement and policing Black bodies and investing in the destruction of Black bodies does nothing for any good community. And as well, one of the things that turned me into a prison abolitionist was when I heard, I got to hear Angela Davis speak. And the first thing that she said was, the only way that the government has of policing your gender is the prison system, because the only reason they need to know what your gender is on an ID is in order to know which prison to put you in. Other than that, your gender makes no difference. That's the only real reason it's on there. And things like that were the moments where I began to realize how deeply and insidious policing and the prison system truly goes, even down to the simple fact of in nightlife, Pride just now is getting to the point of saying that there's no police going to be at Pride, when the reason we have Stonewall riots is because the police and police brutality. But the police have done nothing but brutalize and tear down community after community of brown people, Black people, indigenous people, and they've done it in the guise of white supremacy. And so for me, I completely concur with everything they've been saying. And on top of it, for me, fully, completely, when I walk down a block, I fully know that my enemy is the police and they're not on my side. The same way that I went into the train station last week and literally there was 5 different police officers like lining the front of it. And I immediately chose to walk 45 minutes out of my way, then go into that train station. It's one of those things where I've had family members murdered. I've had family friends murdered by the police. I have friends serving multiple life sentences for things that they legitimately didn't do, that we have proof that they literally just can't get out of jail for. So it's like, I even have a personal connection to it all. And so, yeah, every single day when I walk down the street as a Black trans woman, I think about Marsha and I think about the fact that we still don't know who murdered her. We still don't have an answer to that crime. We still don't have an answer to the fact that they disbanded and tore apart Marsha and Sylvia's organization STAR. So there's still so much retribution that we have not gotten for the injustice they've done, let alone thinking about, oh, what's the positive things they can do, when there isn't anything positive they can do for us because they've already shown us from a track record. They don't stop crime, they respond to it. And that's the key thing.
And you are referring, can you say a little bit more about Marsha, Sylvia, and that history that you're referring to? I was about to launch into it myself, but I think you'll do more justice to it than I will. So briefly, will you just, for those who may not know? I mean, there are documentaries, there are films, there are, but give us a little history.
And funny enough, a lot of those documentaries are using footage that was actually stolen and co-opted from a Black trans artist in Brooklyn named Tourmaline. If you watch the Netflix documentary, Exactly. And the Netflix documentary, I can't remember what the name of it is. I never watched it, but they stole and co-opted a bunch of footage from Tourmaline, a Black trans woman in Brooklyn, who found all this footage, archived this footage, digitalized this footage, and then they stole it and never gave her any money for it and used it in a Netflix documentary. And so that is a good example of what has happened with Marsha and Sylvia's legacy. After Stonewall, in the 70s, white gay people kicked basically Marsha and Sylvia off of Pride, off of like any form of being on stage or being public in Pride because they were trans. Basically, the movement was heteronormative and cis. So if you weren't that, you weren't getting a part of it. And so the movement they began, they got kicked out of. And then on top of it, afterwards, they created a whole organization called STAR, the Street Transvestites. I can't remember what the Action Revolutionaries. And it basically housed and took care of street youth, Black trans people, Black trans people, brown trans people, any person who was on the streets and needed a home. They helped to form this entire, basically the modern form of queer revolution that you're seeing right now is based off of the model that they created from STAR, because they not only owned a housing complex, which they used for the housing, they from their sex work money would use it to fund the housing, but also find sponsors and people who would donate money. So a lot of the grassroots organizing in the queer community that happens is all based off of Marsha and Sylvia. But then the 80s came, and crime and as well, basically Black trans people got pushed even further to the curb. And that's why you don't see like Marsha and Sylvia and things like Paris is Burning, because she was murdered by then. And they had, so the city basically encroached upon their entire organization and have it shut it down. So,
and just for people who want to look it up, it's Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And Marsha was murdered. And and the crime still has not been solved. And a lot of people feel that NYPD neglected to dig deeply into the murder of Marsha P. Johnson because she was a trans Black and activist, not just the identity politics, but also the activism. So
and I'll add
we should do a whole nother panel. We'll do a whole nother panel, Junior Mintt. A whole nother. You can add one other thing. Okay, go ahead, because I want to get back over to. Miss Major, right. But I'm pitching a panel. I'm pitching a whole nother panel on this. I promise you. Let me come back over to you, Elizabeth Hinton, as we run down on time. I do want to ask, and then I'm going to ask all three of you a final question that I got right here in my chat about hope. So think about hope. But Elizabeth, let me just ask you, coming off of what Junior Mintt said about the history of policing tied to the legacy of slavery, because this comes up all the time. Can you, 30-second lecture, can you tell us what that connection is for people who don't understand that that historical rooting of policing in our history of enslavement, to the extent there is a connection? Because some people on this in this webinar may not know about that.
Yes, so the policing, as we know it today, is very much tied to both settler colonialism and slavery. And, the constables that were established by early colonists essentially policed indigenous communities in the US. And during the antebellum period, slave patrols formed, which basically allowed any white person, or which empowered any white person to ransack slave dwellings, to break up the gatherings of enslaved Africans, to confiscate contraband, meaning like books or guns, right? Because enslaved people were legally prohibited from reading. And these laid the kind of logics that we see still in policing today, and that is the targeted surveillance and social control of people of color. So, the kind of modern police forces, the uniformed people, with guns and caps that we know them today, didn't directly grow out of slave patrols, but the logics of policing of both indigenous communities and enslaved Africans have deeply, deeply continued to shape the kind of fundamental strategies of policing today. That is protecting property in white and middle class communities and arresting people and facilitating their removal and incarceration in low-income communities of color and against marginalized groups.
So my last question for each of you then, as I indicated, and I guess Elizabeth will stay with you to start, what gives you hope?
I have to say, you know, like last summer gave me a lot of hope. I think what people are calling the largest mobilization in United States history. I think younger generations definitely give me hope. One thing that Nialah alluded to is that, you know, protest evolves. And I think that, especially I look at my students, undergraduate students, they have, you know, they were born during Obama, they came of age and consciousness during the Trump administration, and now COVID and the racial protests of last summer, the witnessing all of this police violence and injustice. You know, they're not standing for it anymore. They actually want to hold this country accountable to the founding principle of equality. They want to create a different America, and they want, I mean, what we've been talking about. They don't want taxpayer dollars to continue to go to policing and surveillance and incarceration at the expense of education and healthcare and just fundamental basic human rights that would lead to a much more vibrant society. So I'm really counting on the younger generations to help bring about a more equitable, a more inclusive United States.
Nialah Edari, what gives you hope?
You're muted, Nialah.
Mute. Hey, definitely just repeating what Elizabeth said last year, just being someone who has been organizing and outside since 2012 and again in 2014, and Black Lives Matter being a taboo statement, and more people are comfortable and we're having these conversations, but we're also like, okay, we're done talking, we're ready for the actionable items, and if you don't do this, we're gonna push forward. And just seeing so many people outside. FYI, Jami, I know you just hopped on before the pre-call, but I will be joining protesters soon. My organization, we organized a march in honor of George Floyd's one year anniversary of his death. We'll be headed to Brooklyn. So for the Q&A, my camera will be off because I have to, you know, be outside with my peoples. And that's why I'm here, because I'm an organizer and this is what I actually do. I'm outside. So just wanted to say that.
We appreciate you. We appreciate you. Junior Mintt, what gives you hope?
When I think about hope, the thing that gives me the biggest hope is seeing more and more people who look like me, sound like me, represent communities that I come from, getting the due that they deserve in terms of getting their flowers and getting the platforms. Because for me, the thing that gives me the most joy and hope is that it's not 4 Black men sitting on this panel having a conversation about this. It's us getting to sit here, getting to talk in all of our beauty, all of our intersectionality, all of our intelligence, all of our wisdom. And for me, that is what I never got to see on the screen growing up. That's the thing where I never got to hear my perspective told until I actually went to college and saw For Colored Girls as a play. That was the first time I had my first connection to something where I was like, oh, you can connect to things. And so for me, I'm imagining how many people will watch this, how many people will see one of our faces and say, that person, I really connected with what they said. And having it be one of us when no one else can fill our shoes and no one else can speak from our perspective. So to see us here in this moment, getting to talk about our perspectives and getting to have a dialogue it gives me so much hope, because I see it happening in so many different spaces and environments. And that's the dream. That's the dream. I want to see more and more people who have been so disenfranchised in this society getting their due and their microphone.
Well, I love your energy, Junior Mintt. It gives me hope. And I agree with you. This panel in and of itself gives me great hope as well. I want to say a very big thank you to Junior Mintt, to Nialah Edari, and thank you for your work and your protest movement, your policy work, and getting out there tonight in memory of George Floyd. and to Elizabeth Hinton, all of your excellent scholarship and thoughtful work as well. And of course, we want to say a very big thank you to our hosts and the wonderful partnership between the Brooklyn Public Library and NYU. And to our audience tonight, thank you for leaning in with us. Please do the work as well. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you.
You're amazing, Junior Mintt. And so are you, Nialah. You both give me so much hope and inspiration. Thank you.
And I would definitely love to connect with both of y'all after this.
Yes. Let's make it happen.
Same. Absolutely.